ChuckWagon MTG is sponsored by BC Comics and Games. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another great deck tech here on ChuckWagon MTG. Today we look at Cursed Ground, a Grixis Pauper build. This deck uses your opponent's own lands against them, while we sit back and slowly hit them indirectly and set up our boards to move in for the kill. And if you happen to like this deck tech, check out even more of them by clicking on the link above. So let's start off by looking at the enchantments we're going to be running. We have 4 copies of Font of Ire, an enchantment for 1 generic and 1 red mana. You can pay 3 generic and 1 red mana, sacrifice Font of Ire, and it deals 5 damage to target player. This can be a great little finisher. Next up, we have 4 copies of Contaminated Ground, an enchantment aura for 1 generic and 1 black mana that enchants a land, and that land becomes a swamp. Whenever enchanted land becomes tapped, its controller loses 2 life. Then we have 4 copies of Psychic Venom, another enchantment aura for 1 generic and 1 blue mana that enchants a land, and whenever that land becomes tapped, Psychic Venom deals 2 damage to that land's controller. Now, these last 2 are really going to slow down our opponent's early game. Contaminated Ground can be devastating early game if our opponents aren't running black, and even if they are, it's going to hit them for 2 life every time they use the land, and same goes for Psychic Venom. They're going to be losing life while we set up our board. Now, let's take a look at the creatures we're going to be running. We have 2 copies of Grim Guardian, a 1/4 enchantment creature for 2 generic and 1 black mana that has Constellation. Whenever Grim Guardian or another enchantment enters the battlefield under our control, each opponent is going to lose 1 life. This is going to work great with all the other enchantments we have for getting in every little point of damage that we can. Next, we have 2 copies of Firebrand Archer, a 2/1 creature for 1 generic and 1 red mana, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Firebrand Archer deals 1 damage to each opponent. Once again, this is just another way to take advantage of the amount of non-creature spells we have and get in for even more non-combat damage. We then have 4 copies of Sage of Epityr, a 1/1 creature for 1 blue mana, and when the Sage comes into play, look at the top 4 cards of our library, and then we get to put them back in any order. This wizard's purpose is strictly to help us find the cards we need to set up our board or possibly deal with threats, and then become a chump blocker. And then next, we have 2 copies of Kiln Fiend, a 1/2 creature for 1 generic and 1 red mana, and whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, Kiln Fiend gets +3/+0 until end of turn. This is another creature that's going to take advantage of all the non-creature spells, instants and sorceries to be exact, that we have to be running in the deck. He can be a great finisher, even take out the bigger beastie creatures that your opponents have on board. And lastly, we have 3 copies of Gurmag Angler, a 5/5 creature for 6 generic and 1 black mana that has Delve. This fishy friend of ours can make great use of our spent instants and sorceries, as well as his fallen comrades, and be a hefty presence on board rather early in the game. Now let's check out the instants and sorceries that we're going to be running. We have 3 copies of Murderous Compulsion, a sorcery for 1 generic and 1 black mana that says destroy target tapped creature. It also has a madness of the same casting cost. We also have 2 copies of Mana Leak, an instant for 1 generic and 1 blue mana that counters a target spell unless its controller pays an additional 3 generic mana. This is just another way to keep threats off the board or to help protect our board. Then we have 3 copies of Ponder, a sorcery for 1 blue mana that says look at the top 3 cards of our library, then we get to put them back in any order. We can shuffle if we want to, and then we get to draw a card. And we also have 4 copies of Preordain, a sorcery for 1 blue mana that says scry 2, and then we get to draw a card. These are both to help us find the cards that we need to set up our board and to deal with the opponents as we need to. Our land base consists of 2 copies of Bojuka Bog. It can be tapped to add 1 black mana to our mana pool. It does enter the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, it exiles all cards from target player's graveyard. This is going to be for any Delver, Reanimator, or Flashback decks we happen to run into, anything that loves to pull stuff from the graveyard. We also have 4 copies each of Dismal Backwater and Swiftwater Cliffs. They do enter the battlefield tapped, but they also gain us a life when they enter, and they can both be tapped for 2 different kinds of mana. And then we have 4 swamps, 5 mountains, and 4 islands to finish off our land base. Our sideboard has 3 copies of Negate, which is an instant for 1 generic and 1 blue mana that counters a non-creature spell, and then we also have 2 more copies of Mana Leak. This is just in case we find ourselves needing a bit more control. We also have 4 copies of Uncontrolled Infestation, an enchantment for 1 generic and 1 red mana that can only be cast on a non-basic land, but when that land becomes tapped, you destroy it. So this is going to help us shut down any kind of Tron players we run into. Next, we have 3 copies of Lingering Death. This is an enchantment for 1 generic and 1 black mana that makes them sacrifice their creature at the end of their turn. So essentially, this is going to be for any creature-heavy decks or any decks that have indestructible creatures. And lastly, we have 3 copies of Alms of the Vein, a sorcery for 2 generic and 1 black mana that target opponent loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. It also has a madness casting cost of just 1 black mana, and this is going to be for any burn mashups we happen to come against. Well, that about wraps up our deck tech for Cursed Ground, a fun Pauper deck that punishes your opponent for playing most anything while we set up our board and get ready for the kill. Now, if you happen to play this deck at a tournament or even at your kitchen table, please let us know how you did, as well as any of your thoughts on the deck down in the comments. And even if you didn't play this, but you still have some thoughts, we'd love to hear those too down in the comments. If you like what you saw here today, click that like button, be sure to hit subscribe, and share this with your friends, your family, your loved ones, and your pets. Everyone could use a little more magic in their lives. Thank you very much for joining us, and as always, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, ChuckWagon MTG. Now, if you could do us a huge favor and check out this brief message about our sponsor. ChuckWagon MTG is sponsored by BC Comics and Games. They have 3 different locations, and they run Magic events every Monday through Saturday, and their Friday Night Magic consists of Standard, Modern, and Legacy every week. This is why I've personally made BC Comics and Games my home gaming store.